Napoleon believed that he had been tricked by the British into falsely believing if he surrendered to them, that he'd be able to live the rest of his days in comfort somewhere in England. But as he got off the ship and was greeted with the volcanic island of St Helena, it became very obvious that how he envisioned his future was a far cry from the reality he faced. Napoleon was allowed to bring some people with him to the island, but not nearly as many as he had originally had with him when he surrendered. All in all, 27 people had accompanied him, which included valets, a butler, grooms, a cook, a pastry cook, someone that was in charge of the silver, and the surgeon from the original ship he had surrendered to, since his own surgeon did not want to come. The island was small, only 122 square kilometers, and boasted a population of 4,218 people in 1815. Of those, 3,395 were Europeans living there, 489 Chinese, 218 slaves, and 116 were Indian and Malay. And 2,500 of that total number were to guard Napoleon. The structure that was set to hold Napoleon and his entourage was called Longwood. It was an old, derelict farmhouse that required a considerable amount of work before it was inhabitable. So, the British government had ordered a prefabricated wooden house and furniture to be shipped over. In the meantime, Napoleon stayed with an agent of the East India Company named William Balcombe at his home called the Briars. The rest of his party stayed a mile away at the only town on the island, Jamestown. It would be almost 2 months that Napoleon stayed with the Balcombes, and the lodgings he stayed in were what could be best described as a makeshift shed. While he was there, he dictated some of the most important events of his life for his memoirs. He spent time riding horses, always with an escort, as he was to be constantly watched over us to make sure he would not escape. Sometimes he would go out for a drive, and in the evenings he would dine, often with the Balcombes. He became friendly with their 4 children and would play games with them. He was particularly fond of the second daughter, named Betsy. Betsy was a beautiful, rambunctious girl who spoke French, and the two bonded. They would play blind man's bluff, laugh, tease each other, and when Betsy was older, she wrote a memoir about the time spent with Napoleon on the island. When Longwood was finally ready in December, Napoleon moved in. He had a painting of his wife, Marie-Louise, put on the wall, and a bust of the King of Rome put directly beneath it. His new life quite quickly began to sink in. The roof at Longwood leaked horribly. Damp affected everything from wood to clothing to books and even papers. There were rats, and the floor began to rot. The climate of St. Helena was damp and mosquitoes abounded. Even in these conditions, Napoleon continued to dress in full uniform for dinner, and had those in his entourage wear formal attire. There were still reminders around him of his former life. Some art, some silver, a coffee set that had some highlights of his life and career painted on it. He had a garden installed at Longwood that he enjoyed tending and watering and continually added on to it. He saw guests, but they always had to be approved in advance. If he was sent something, everything was meticulously gone through and often sent back. There was an exceeding concern that Napoleon would somehow escape, even though it was virtually impossible to attack or successfully escape from the island. That, however, did not deter the British government from spending what is estimated at £250,000 a year on keeping Napoleon well guarded and safely staying exactly where he was. Some of this money was spent on the 125 men who watched him during the day and 72 at night, and on the 2 ships that went around the island continuously. As time progressed, Napoleon's movements were restricted. He was not allowed to have as many people in his household. Some of his entourage left. Expenses were cut. And the weather was again horrible. Napoleon began to be depressed, isolate himself, and his health began to deteriorate. By the end of 1816, Napoleon started having fevers, coughing fits, and extremely painful urination. A year later, Napoleon's doctor was forced to leave because it was believed he was a spy in cahoots with Napoleon. And not long after, Napoleon became very ill, and a request was made for a new doctor. But the governor in charge of the island didn't believe there was really anything wrong with Napoleon. A medic was offered by the governor from the military camp, but Napoleon refused. Napoleon shut himself in his room, but did eventually let a British surgeon in, who diagnosed him with hepatitis. But still, the governor thought that this was all a lie, and the surgeon was arrested and dismissed. It wasn't until September of 1819 that finally 2 older priests and a young doctor with very little experience joined Napoleon's household to look after him. But by this time, Napoleon was incredibly ill, and his health was continuing to deteriorate quickly.